I'm Devin Patrick Hughes. Welcome, everyone, with the Boulder Symphony. We are so excited and honored to present for you all coming up, and this is September 13th, 6 p.m. at the JCC, a not-to-be-missed event with the Takács Quartet, and I'm joined by Ed Dusinberre, the first violinist and the leader here. Welcome, Ed. I'm so grateful and honored to be speaking with you today.
Oh, great to be here. Nice to be chatting with you.
So you have a varied program, and it's interesting because you're not playing any full pieces, but you're playing, the program includes the Mozart D minor, K421, the Coleridge Taylor, two of his five fantasy Stück, the Debussy, the second half of that string quartet, and the Bartok, the last movement of his first string quartet. Can you talk about performing movements of works, and maybe if there's any kind of extra musical link to this program?
Sure. Well, I think during these crazy and challenging times that we're living in, I think we, like many other people, have been thinking about how best to present music, and have to say, first of all, how incredibly grateful we are to the Boulder Symphony for having us to do this concert, which I think is unique for us. I don't think we've ever done a drive-in concert like this, and we're extremely grateful. So anyway, I think sometimes this kind of more informal format where you can play a movement and then chat a little bit is actually working better. And so we've tried to shape a program that is just really well balanced. We're starting with the first movement of this Mozart quartet. It's one of our favorites. It's in D minor. And as is so often the case with Mozart, the mood swings. It just turns on a dime. You know, it's 1 minute you think it's quite sort of grazioso and beautiful, and the next minute it's quite foreboding and quite dark. And being Mozart, he manages to do it in this kind of quicksilver, magical way. And then we're following it with, as you said, two movements from Samuel Coleridge Taylor's 5 fantasy Stücke, wonderful pieces that we only discovered fairly recently. Samuel Coleridge Taylor was half English and half African, and he was born and grew up in London. He actually went to the Royal College of Music, and he was pretty well known back at the end of the 19th century, both in this country and also in England. And it's been a joy for us to discover his music, which are little character pieces, very vital, and also great writing for the quartet. So that seemed a nice continuation. And then the Bartok is an old friend of ours. Obviously, we've played a lot of Bartok over the years. This particular part of the first quartet, the introduction and then the last movement, is kind of works well on its own. Bartok is feeling pretty sorry for himself earlier in the piece. There's a love affair that went a bit wrong, and this is a moment that he kind of pulls himself out of that, and the piece is full of folk music influence and just tremendous vitality of life. And then the Debussy, the third and fourth movements. The third movement is a particularly wonderful viola piece, really, and we're delighted to be still in the early stages of working with our new violist, Richard O'Neill. So that's one reason we wanted to play that. It's also happens to be one of the greatest quartets ever written. Again, the slow movement is magically beautiful. The kind of texture, the velvety, mysterioso quality. And the last movement's got a lot of excitement and drama in it.
So I wonder, you talked about kind of a new era of presenting concerts and interacting with the audience. I'm wondering about the stories behind the music, because there is also a very dramatic element behind this program. Like, for example, the Mozart, it's my understanding that his wife was giving birth to their son, who would actually end up, who Haydn offered to teach upon Mozart's death. But she was giving birth in this turbulent key of D minor, which of course is, you talk about Mozart's mood swings and the shifts back, the operatic shifts back and forth. So Don Giovanni is in D minor, the 20th piano concerto, all the way to the Bartok, where you referred to this. he was 26, 27-year-old guy, like just a kid. He gets broken up with by Steffi Geyer, who he intended to write the first violin concerto and has her theme in this major seventh chord. And of course, she breaks up with him. He writes not only the first string quartet, but the bagatelles, where the two last movements are "She is dead" and kind of depicts her dancing in this grotesque waltz. Can you talk about just how that histrionic element relates to your performance or your presentation of quartet playing?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, first of all, to go back to the Mozart anecdote, it's not totally clear whether that actually happened. It's one of those great sort of anecdotes that we like to imagine. I think what we can definitely say is that there was a lot of turbulence in Mozart's life, and we certainly hear that in his music. And I like your use of the word histrionics. I think, of course, for all of us, it's been a very difficult period, this last stretch, for a lot of different reasons. And of course, we feel very privileged, really. We're much more fortunate than many. But I think in our programming, maybe we've been a little bit aware of wanting to try and touch a wide range of emotions and to show the volatility that can be expressed through music. But I think also that can be quite cathartic and quite healing. And so in this program, there's also moments of great repose and beauty. And I think in the case of Bartok, I couldn't have described better his love affair with Steffi Geyer and how that came to an end. I think, though, it was also a very exciting period of his life when he was starting to travel around Eastern Europe and really get involved with village communities and folk musicians and the amazing instruments they played and the sounds they make, and more than that, just the whole lifestyle. And so I think you can hear that vivacity in his music. And Bartok in the end became a great internationalist. He didn't just write about Hungarian folk music. He used music from all over Eastern Europe and even from Africa. And he was always looking for the connections between different bits of music, and a folk song in Slovakia that might sound quite similar to one that he heard in Turkey in a small village. And so I think his whole philosophy is a lot about breaking down borders and the way music can travel across borders. And so I think also there's a lot of drama in our program, but also hopefully it's life affirming in certain ways at this challenging and kind of pivotal time that we find ourselves in.
I think you come from a very unique perspective in that regard, because these two composers, Beethoven's not on the program, but you can't really talk to Takács without talking about Beethoven, because these two composers, both Beethoven and Bartok, Beethoven, because of his deafness, because of his distaste for the current status quo in many ways, wrote these changes, fixed his own problems into his music. Bartok does that in a different way, 100 years later. Can you talk about this kind of life affirmation that works out? And of course, this is a great opportunity just to plug your incredible book that I didn't read all of it, but I read some of it. Beethoven for a Later Age by Edward Dusinberre is a fantastic, just a overview kind of storytelling behind not only the Beethoven quartets, but how your quartet kind of found its voice and basically used these quartets to affirm probably your own ideas about life and about family and about love and about community, all these things that these composers do. Can you kind of talk about that? I'd be curious to hear your interpretation of like Beethoven's idea or Bartok's idea of this life affirmation, of this need to change the world through music.
Well, I think, a string quartet seems to have inspired the greatest composers to, in a way, take the most chances. So if you look at Beethoven's quartets, starting with his Opus 18s and going through to his late quartets, or same with Bartok, starting with the first, going to the last, they they're really radical in the way they experiment. And it's not just in the ways that you can obviously hear to do with tonality or structure or the way you might juxtapose one emotion against another. It's also to do with the relationships between the players in the quartet. That changes a lot. And so you can hear, I think, in both of those pieces, this amazing tension between four individuals who are given voices which should be really expressive in their own right. And yet somehow or other, we're all supposed to make some kind of unified effect at the end. And that's really a great symbol for what we all struggle with in life, how to be expressive as individuals and to feel like we can manage to be true to ourselves in some sense, but also to have a duty and a responsibility to other people, and which is, of course, is extremely important and very hard as well. And so I think you can somehow feel all of those tensions within actually all of the pieces that we're playing in this program.
So just a couple notes. I know you mentioned the Samuel Coleridge Taylor is a new piece for you guys. And I had not heard the piece. It's a student piece, and it's just learning a little bit about Coleridge Taylor. He was promoted by A.J. Yeager, who's Elgar's best friend and the inspiration behind the biblical Nimrod and the Enigma variations. But also Coleridge Taylor kind of meets up with many of the big names from the later 1800s. The first movement from the Fantasy Stück, the Prelude, it almost reminds me of this, Brahms sonata or symphony with its melody, with its duple against triple. And the third movement could just as easily be a Dvorak scherzo in many ways. Do you see any kind of links in this piece that kind of tie it into the greater Western music canon?
I think it's that. I think when one looks at a new piece of music and when one doesn't know the voice of a particular composer, of course we're trying to put it in context. But and I certainly hear what you're saying. But I think equally well we could look at it the other way. So, for example, of course, we know how influenced Dvorak was by African American spirituals and how interested he was by Native American culture when he was here in this country. And so I think there's a wonderful cross-fertilization. And so I think when one hears similarities between Coleridge Taylor and Dvorak, for example, what you're really hearing is a similarity of interest that the two composers have in certain types of culture, certain types of folk song, spiritual, and the way that plays out. Having said that, of course, Coleridge Taylor went to the Royal College of Music, studied with various composers there who I'm sure encouraged him in certain directions to absorb the Western tradition, the Western canon. But I think what's very effective with him is it's very much his own voice. And it's a shame that that's one of many voices that has not been given enough prominence in the last however many years. And certainly I think we feel ashamed that we didn't learn about this piece sooner. But we're very much enjoying it now that we do know it.
Are there other kind of pieces or composers from more underrepresented voices over the ages or living that you guys are starting to get into more?
Well, earlier in the summer we played. We also learned about Florence Price, and she's written some very beautiful works. I was aware of her symphony and symphonies, and particularly the success that she had in Chicago with the Chicago Symphony. But we played a movement again in a sort of medley concert. We played a movement from one of her string quartets that's very beautiful. And I think, in general, with commissioning, looking ahead, we're absolutely, like everyone else, we're examining a little bit the repertoire choices we have made and hoping to be more diverse with that in the future. And that can be to do with commissioning. It can also be, for example, we played the quartet of Fanny Hensel, or Fanny Mendelssohn, Mendelssohn's sister. We'll be recording that later this fall, actually. So yeah, these are very reflective times, I think, for musicians and for everyone else. And that one of the ways that comes out is in our thoughts about programming.
In terms of rehearsing, I love a lot of the things that, I mean, string quartet playing. As a conductor, I've never played in a string quartet, but as a conductor, I feel like the more an orchestra can play like a string quartet, the more successful we can experiment and, like you talk about, not do things as rehearsed. Can you talk about that idea of a concert as not being a finished result and always an ongoing process? And I would also ask, should quartets or orchestras ever play it safe?
Should they ever play it safe? I mean, my instinct is to say absolutely not. But if I'm being completely honest, when you're up against it with a brand new contemporary piece and it's your first performance, there are certain like pragmatic choices you make. Like, you definitely have what you might call meeting points every little while. And I mean, that I suppose is an element of playing safe. So I have to say, depends a little bit on the circumstances. But I think the point of rehearsing eventually is to create a trust between the players that within a certain framework that you've talked about, emotions or just the character that you want to convey, or the tempo, or the type of sound you want to make, that's great. That's a foundation. But then hopefully within a concert, that trust means that there is much more of an element of flexibility. And I think the best analogy is really with actors on stage. They might be doing a performance of King Lear 7 times a week. They all know their parts very well, their speeches, and of course they also know exactly what's going to happen in the play. But as an audience member, you don't want to get that impression from them. You want to feel that when you get to the end of King Lear, and there's that wonderful kind of forgiveness scene with Cordelia forgiving her father. Just one example. You don't want to feel that that's the scene that they played out already 6 times this week. So I think that's the way that they manage to convey that it's fresh and that they are acting in the moment is to do with how carefully they're listening to each other. So if there's just one slight intonational difference in the way a phrase or a word is emphasized, then if the other actor is listening really carefully, that will affect their own delivery. Similarly with body language, and it's very much true for us in a string quartet. But I think going back, trust is the thing that's the most important in that, because that's what allows you to kind of let go of your own ego in a way, and your own insecurities that we all inevitably have. But when it's working well in a quartet, you can kind of check those at the door and just go on an adventure.
Can you talk about, you've been in Boulder for about 30 years, and you came here as a Juilliard student of Dorothy DeLay, English, and you kind of threw yourself and you immersed yourself in this Hungarian, like the Verbunkos style, which I feel doesn't just apply to music of Haydn or Liszt or Bartok, but it really is the heart and soul of kind of the Austro-Germanic and European tradition, like this fire, this passion that many musicians are not necessarily trained, and you really have to experience it in Hungary or with Hungarian musicians. Can you talk about like maybe your musical preferences before and after you became immersed with this style and this way of life, and how that changed you?
Sure. I mean, I had 2 very different teachers, equally wonderful. In London at the Royal College, I studied with a guy called Felix Andrievsky, who was a Ukrainian violinist.
Okay.
And he had actually had a reputation back in when he was teaching at the Central School in Moscow for being really pretty ferocious disciplinarian. But by the time he got to the Royal College, he was easing up a bit. And although he did teach technique, he was an extraordinarily inspiring teacher, very, very colourful, and and also he would give you ideas, wonderful images to work with, but he was very alive to the fact that it had to come from you. You know, he would sort of criticize me. Well, you're just doing what I told you to do. That's not good enough. You know, you've got to inhabit it yourself. So I left my lessons with him just wanting to play the whole time. Dorothy DeLay kind of was great for me in a different sort of a way, and her assistant teacher. They kind of wanted to firm things up a little bit. So, you know, maybe for the day that you're not feeling quite so inspired, or, you know, you feel a bit sick or something like that, but you've still got all the basics there that can get you through. So I found the combination great. I have to say, when I joined the Takács, really, I was incredibly lucky with my three friends and colleagues, Kari, Gabor Mai, and András Feyer, András is obviously still in the group. They were so supportive and welcoming to me, and never condescending. I think when someone new joins, especially someone as young as I was, they could have made life quite difficult, and they were really so nice. And there was such a sense of adventure and fun in the way that they played. And, you know, it took me definitely some time to find my feet and to, as you say, get used to a certain approach to music making. There were certain things, obviously, that I felt very comfortable with. Otherwise, the whole thing wouldn't have worked. But, you know, it's fragile when you join a quartet. And I think the thing that helped the most was a couple of things, both their attitude, their incredible supportiveness, and also the whole Boulder community and the university somehow allowed me to ease into that position.
So you kind of talk a lot about your relationship with like Chopin-Zai, the original violinist, and I think of, you know, many symphonic works or larger choral works were not played sometimes in the composer's lifetime, but the string quartet was truly the lab in which the composer could experiment. And I feel like Beethoven is a populist in his symphonies, but in a string quartet, he's the innovator of all time. And of course, he innovates in other genres as well. But can you talk about just thinking about, like, you know, with Mozart's string quartets, Haydn, Mozart, Dittersdorf, Von Hall in the string quartet. You know, same with Beethoven to some extent in his string quartets, with all these other Spohr, all these composers / performers who were probably, like you say in your book, Beethoven for a Later Age, they're probably giving him feedback. And of course, we know about Beethoven, Brahms, they would generally not incorporate too much other feedback into their works. Can you just talk about like that lab setting and maybe that feeling of camaraderie with these generations from hundreds of years ago?
Yeah, that's a great, very rich area to talk about. I think in the case of Mozart, you've also got to imagine that chamber music for Mozart was not such a thing of like lots of rehearsals. He would bring some parts over to a bunch of friends and they'd sit down and read them. And Mozart maybe wasn't imagining quite the type of way that we generally work these days. And that creates a challenge for us, because when you're playing a concert, an audience doesn't want to feel that we've got no idea what's coming around the corner. You know, that's not what you guys are signed up for, yeah, when you listen to us. But on the other hand, that element of spontaneity, of being surprised by, oh, that's what happened over there. What's András doing? Or, you know, what's Harumi there? What's that in the viola part? Richard, what are you doing over there? That's that spirit of spontaneity and surprise and delight. We have to retain that with many hours of rehearsing as well. So that's one aspect. By the time Beethoven comes, it's a little bit different. And Razumovsky, his patron who commissioned the three quartets, realized that the musicians needed a bit more of a structure to rehearse. And he sort of created one of the first residencies so that players could really work on things and get them to a higher level. And I think Schuppanzich and his buddies, it was pretty tough playing those quartets the first time. And for me, when I first joined the quartet, you know, I was quite intimidated as well, and I found it quite most of the time I found it quite helpful reading these stories that actually first performances were a bit shaky, and it took people a bit of a while to work out what they were doing. I didn't find it quite so reassuring to read that Schuppanzich got fired as first violinist after the first performance of Opus 127. That story wasn't so helpful to me. But to your thing about the lab, I mean, actually, I think Beethoven was more influenced and more listening to the musicians than we might think. He's got that kind of stereotypical sense of someone who's fiery and stubborn and doesn't listen to people. But for example, at the end of Opus 127, in a rehearsal, the replacement first violinist, Joseph Böhm, who took over from Schuppanzich and then played the second concert, which went much better. He was Hungarian, actually. So he, at least this is his version of events, he suggested to Beethoven a different tempo at the end of 127. And Beethoven apparently was like, yeah, that works better. So I'd be even more convinced by this story if I could hear Beethoven's side of it. But I think we can assume that Beethoven did actually, there was some real interaction between both ways, between the composer and his musicians. And the other thing that's poignant for me is that at the end of his life, Beethoven was so isolated with his deafness, and he didn't have many family and friends. And I think some of his best and most enriching interactions were with these musicians. And in the works, he kind of creates sometimes these ideal conversations and interactions and dialogues, which were sadly lacking in his own life.
And you mentioned about the tempi. There's the great metronome debate. I know in the symphonies, Beethoven went back at the end of his life, presumably because he wasn't satisfied with the tempis that were being taken. But the string quartets, he's not necessarily writing metronome markings.
He does for the Opus 18s. He went back later. I think he was asked by his publisher to come up with some. His metronome markings are quite controversial. They're sometimes extremely fast for the quartets, and we are not very rigid about that. I'm afraid to say that if we find ourselves playing a tempo that happens to be the one that he's requested, then we sort of pat ourselves on the head and feel very, very pleased with ourselves. But there are certainly plenty of occasions when we don't do that, and we justify that. Perhaps, we don't know how accurate his metronome was. We also don't know if it was, a long time later, what else he was doing that day. Maybe he was trying to finish his Ninth Symphony.
He had a lot of coffee or something.
Right. And also there's the matter of acoustics. I think that the tempo at which you play something depends a lot. If you're in a big resonant palace, then you need to slow things down. If you're in a small dry space, or if you've got a microphone right next to you, then you're going to play faster. So I don't think you can be too rigid, but it is interesting with the late quartets. Second violinist Carl Holz, he wrote down a lot of metronome markings that presumably had to do with their first rehearsals, and wow, that's quite interesting to pay attention to.
And I know that a big object of contention is your audition piece, the Opus 59, the Razumovsky, the number 3, the last Allegro con fuoco or Allegro non troppo. It's not non troppo. What is that metric?
I think that's a good question. I think it's just Allegro, but it's certainly not non. There's certainly no qualifying thing.
Yeah, it's nothing.
It could be Allegro molto. You've caught me there. I should really know that.
Do you, as you mature musically, do you find yourself slowing down? And a second question to that, do you generally in a performance go a little faster, a little slower than a rehearsal?
I very much like your assumption that I'm maturing musically. That's very nice. I'll definitely take that. It's tricky. I mean, I think as you get older, you do have a different perspective on things. I think in that last movement, since you mentioned it, 59-3, I've become more aware over the years that it's a very lively, fast, exciting movement, but it comes out of quite a lot of turmoil and suffering in the early music and also in Beethoven's life at the time. So if it's too fast, it sounds a little bit flippant. It sounds like a parody of joyful music. You want something that sounds majestic and joyful and in that sort of way. So things do change. I think it probably would be risky to say that it's just a matter of linear progress. You know, I think one plays things differently.
Mhm.
And there's certainly some things I played in a certain way, or we played as a group 15 years ago, which, you know, I'm very, very happy with and enjoyed very much. I wouldn't necessarily want to play it like that now, but it's not necessarily that one thing's better than the other. You have conversations with your younger selves, and those debates are not straightforward. It's not always a case of the older self, you know, telling the younger self, well, you know, young man, this is how things should be. I think it's more complicated than that.
And in the rehearsal versus the performance, do you generally, do you go faster, slower, or is it a crapshoot?
It's adrenaline related. I think our first outing with a new piece tends to be pretty up there in the tempo. And then if we play a piece for 5, 6, 7 concerts, things kind of shake out and settle in. Having said that, you might well find you can only learn a certain amount in a rehearsal. You know, a concert is worth about 10 rehearsals at a certain point.
Mm-hmm.
And especially to do with things, I'm sure it feels the same for you as a conductor, that, you know, certain things with pacing particularly can feel a certain way in a rehearsal. And it's only really when you get in a concert that you feel, oh yeah, we've got to move forward a bit more, or this climax doesn't have quite enough build up to it, comes out of the blue too much, or, you know, you just become more aware of those things on stage.
I don't exactly know how to ask this question, and I know we're getting to the end of our interview, but Beethoven as a sense of, I mean, the tempo, where the beat is placed, to me, that feels like his personality. That's like reviving him as a person. Can you talk about where the beat is? And in Beethoven, there's this sense of go. You know, a lot of his music, it's go to the goal, go to the end point, as opposed to Brahms, who might be more on the beat, but Beethoven sometimes feels ahead of the beat. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, that's interesting. It maybe depends, obviously, on the particular piece and time of
Mm.
life. So I think there are, and that is something that I'm surprised when I go back and listen to some of our Decca recordings, some of the faster movements. I can sort of hear a little bit the early morning caffeine at breakfast to get us going, and then, you know, 10 a.m. we're kind of really going for it. And there's definitely a lot of forward direction. And I think that is appropriate often for Beethoven's temperament. But it's impossible to generalize. In the late quartets, one of the things that makes them so difficult is that he moves away from that. So something like the Thanksgiving movement to Opus 132, which is this very still chorale.
Mm.
Beethoven, of all people, seems to be going for almost a sense of time stopping.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, obviously, I think as a musician, the way one note goes to the next one it's the storytelling. And so there still is some line even in that really peaceful, ethereal music. So I think later on in his life he mixes that up quite a lot, and maybe the experience of playing the late quartets is that then when you go back to the Opus 18s, I don't feel quite so frantic with them as I maybe did 20 years ago.
What is your favorite thing about Boulder?
Wow, that's a great question. Favorite thing about Boulder, I think it's hard to beat the combination of the university community and the totally gorgeous outdoors environment that we have, and the hopefully liberal political scene here. I think when we used to travel, which seems a very long time ago, it was a wonderful place to come back to rejuvenate, to recuperate. Now, having been here, you know, for a longer period of time than ever since I joined the quartet 27 years ago, I'm again just sort of feel very, very lucky to be here.
Well, you guys are a world treasure, and definitely a Boulder staple, and something that has been around for decades and will be around for decades. And I'm so honored to speak with you today. And just if you're just listening now, and if you're still listening to this interview, check out Beethoven for a Later Age. All the secrets behind the Beethoven quartets and what it's like to be in the Takács quartet. I'm joined by Ed Dusinberre, and we will be presenting, the Boulder Symphony will be presenting the Takács Live Outdoors Drive-In, September 13th at 6 p.m. at the Boulder JCC. Ed, it was so amazing to speak with you today, and I'm really looking forward to your concert. I'm sure many, many others are too.
Thanks so much. It was great to chat, and we also can't wait to play. Thanks.